watching Charter Local Edition. I'm Brad Pomerantz. We are joined by Devin LeMahieu. He is a member of the Wisconsin State Senate, a new member, in fact. I want to get a sense from you, sir. What made you decide to run for office? You have a small business in your community, but you decided to come down to Madison. What made you decide to do that?
Yeah, it was a very interesting election time last year. My representative didn't run again in the assembly, and then my senator at the time jumped into the congressional seat with Congressman Petri retiring.
Wow.
So first my assemblyman didn't run again.
Right.
So I had announced for the assembly seat. And then after my senator, Joe Leibum, jumped into the congressional race, then I had to make that decision whether to jump into the Senate race or...
So what made you pick the Senate over the Assembly? Because there are pluses and minuses to both. The Senate, of course, a body of 33, the Assembly, a body of 99.
You know, my dad was in the Assembly at the time, and he told me I was crazy to run for the Senate.
Okay.
Because it's
Is he still there?
No, he did not run again this last session either.
That's the member who didn't run.
No, he was in a different Assembly seat.
Although it would have been fun to have a father-son situation. Have we had that yet in Wisconsin?
I am not sure. We have brothers.
Okay.
Well, one in the Senate and Assembly with the Fitzgeralds, but...
So why did he say, don't go for the Senate? What made him be so convinced that the Assembly was the body to aspire?
I think when you're part of something, he was in the Assembly for 12 years, and I think being in the Assembly for 12 years, he saw the advantages of maybe a district that's not quite as large and the demands on someone who is a state representative. But the reason I decided to run for the Senate is, you know, you're a 1 in 33 voices instead of 1 in 99, so you have a little bit more sway over what you can get done, and you only have to run for re-election every 4 years.
That is true. So talk to us about how it's been. You've been there for about 6 months. Wisconsin, it's been an exciting, 4 or 5 years, I guess, and there's still a lot of excitement going on in this great state. Talk to us about it.
Well, being brand new in the Senate I found it to be very challenging right away, because you jump in, at least I was a local on the county board, Sheboygan County Board, for 9 years, so at least gave me a little bit, and having a father who was in the Assembly gives you a little bit of knowledge ahead of time, but when you just jump full board into a budget session, right to work debate, you know, things like that, it was very challenging to learn about all the different agencies in the state government and make all the different contacts. And
what's interesting about your tenure so far is you chose to really focus on some very specific issues that were specific to your district, your community. One of them being the speed limit. I mean, it seems like, well, why is this issue in the fore? But it matters. It matters especially in your community.
I think the more rural you get in Wisconsin, the more important an issue like that is. In our area, we find that people commute, the average commute time is over 20 minutes. And you know, 5 miles an hour only saves 1 or 2 minutes, but it's an extra couple minutes. You know, our roads are built to handle, you know, 85, 90 miles an hour. So it just makes sense to let people drive who can drive safely on these interstates.
Was it a tricky issue to get through? I mean, there's no doubt that throughout the Midwest, throughout the country, there is this move to increase the speed limit, kind of a reverse of what we saw 20, 30 years ago. But were you able to build that coalition, bipartisan coalition, as well with the executive branch?
Right. We didn't have a challenge with the executive branch. And we didn't have a challenge in the Assembly. The challenge was actually in the Senate.
Interesting.
Which is where it died last session. And there was sort of a sticking point over whether to include 4-lane roads that had at-grade crossings, which are essentially driveways and you know, stop signs coming up to it. And ultimately, the original bill just let the DOT decide on 4-lane highways based on their safety studies, which we thought made sense, but there was a couple members in the Senate who wanted to make sure that it couldn't be raised up to 70 if there were at-grade crossings. So we finally, after talking to the DOT, we realized that they probably weren't going to put many of these roads up to 70 anyways because of the safety risks of cross traffic going across. So
what do you think of that whole process, the collaborative process, working with an agency, working with other members? You know, you were on the Sheboygan board, but that's obviously a much smaller body. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, being in local government, it's a little different because you don't have that partisan label on you. I mean, granted,
people know
know what direction you're coming from, but you're tasked to work together, and you usually find consensus. broad consensus at the local level. And so yeah, it was a little different working.
Right.
It was a good learning process for the future.
Another issue that you tackled, again, from your press release, not the sexiest, but important, important to your constituents.
Right.
And that dealt with, the local raffle.
Right.
You want to do a fundraiser, and yet who knew raffles were filled with red tape.
Right.
And somehow you decided we needed to get through this. How are you made aware that there was a problem?
Well, actually, my predecessor, Joe Leibum, worked on this bill last session, and it's the only bill that the governor has actually vetoed in the last in his last term. Because
why?
The last bill had some language in that may have conflicted with the gaming compacts.
Interesting.
With the tribes, so he vetoed it. But during the campaign, you learn to talk about, jobs and the economy.
Right.
And I would go to these conservation groups or sportsman groups, and they'd ask me about the raffle bill.
It's fascinating, right?
So I had to go to my campaign staff and say, what in the world are they talking? What's up with this raffle bill?
Exactly.
So after I did a little research on it, it just made sense. So after I was elected, I looked into who was running the bill in the assembly, because it didn't have a Senate lead at the time, and said, can we get this reworked and done?
So what did you have to do to avoid a veto, essentially?
The language that was the challenge was it's other games of chance was listed in there.
Right.
So instead of having it that broad, we narrowly defined what is all permissible, what different types of raffles are permissible in the state of Wisconsin by these nonprofit groups. And it's just so important for these groups, the Rotaries, the sportsman clubs.
It's the little things.
Because that's how they raise almost all their money for their budgets, and that's how all that cash goes back into the communities for protecting the environment or youth clubs, things like that.
So you march into the Senate and you become chair of the Elections Committee, which I'm sure you would think wouldn't necessarily be controversial, but there's always controversy surrounding elections. There's a lot of discussion about redistricting, how lines are drawn. Is it too partisan? Is it hyper-partisan? Talk to us about getting thrown into that maelstrom.
Well, I think redistricting will be on the back burner at this point, but there's a lot of other interesting things that might come before Elections Committee during this session. Campaign finance.
Right.
A lot of our campaign finance law has been found unconstitutional by the Wisconsin Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court. So we need to make sure that we can update it so candidates know what is permissible and what is not permissible. There's talk about reforming the GAB. If you've listened to any political sources, so talk of reforming the GAB, talk of John Doe reform. There's been a bill introduced already about reforming that. So a lot of those issues will potentially be coming before the Elections Committee. I think it's a good committee for a freshman, as they call me, or a rookie like myself to be in, because it's something that's easily to understand and get your mind grasped around elections.
But what's interesting is it impacts your fellow colleagues in the legislature so much. So it's like, the raffle bill, that impacts certain constituencies, whereas the elections, it impacts all of you.
True.
And so there's a high interest level in your committee. And so talk to me about the learning curve. Can't be easy.
Well, it helped that my chief of staff in my office clerked that committee last session for the previous chairperson of that committee. So that was probably one of the reasons why I ended up chairing that committee, is that I had someone with a lot of expertise in my office to help me out. So,
well, all I have to say is congratulations on your new position. His name is Devin LeMahieu. He is a member of the Wisconsin State Senate. My name is Brad Palmer. You're watching Charter Local Edition.